just to take stock of everything and remind myself where we're at with things, remind each other, check and make sure we're all doing all right. Today, we're supposed to be talking about my article, Writing from the Wrong Class, the FWWCP texts that I had. I hope, did everyone get a chance to kind of like look around at them a little bit?
Yes.
I didn't expect you to read all of them or read them word for word, but just like look around. We're going to talk about the finals, whether it's a symposium or an exploration paper. And then next week, one of the things that I have on the very last slide, I think, let me check. I have a lot of slides, but they're not all time intensive. The last thing I have on here is that next week, all students should bring in and submit via D2L a draft of your symposium script. So like what you want to say for your symposium. I don't care that it's not finished. I don't care that it's thinking through. I don't care if there's like, oh my gosh, I have no clue what I'm doing, but I might talk about Dolmage and I might talk about this. But bring in something. Submit something, okay? It can be in very rough form or it can be completely done. You'll get better feedback from your peers if it's completely done because there'll be more to comment on. But the goal next week is for you to have something to show people in your group. Before class, I'll be assigning peer review groups that you can do just for fun. I might have people like in here actually working with people in here as well as online. So we'll figure out computers if anyone needs them or anything. But you'll have those groups ahead of time so you'll be able to see. Now, I actually want us to have class and spend the time doing that. So it'll maybe be a little bit weird because you're going to be on your computer like working for a little while and not talking as a group. But I would like us to actually do a peer review in class time. Although technically if people post them ahead of time and you have your groups, you can do it ahead of time as well. But we're designating class time to do that. Does that make sense? If any of you do peer review in your undergrad classes, you know what I'm talking about. I'll have kind of a peer review activity where I ask you certain questions and you'll work your way through. I gotta see how many people will do it. We've had a couple people drop, so probably be groups of 4-ish, but I'll check. So that's for next week. There's no readings for next week. Nothing else. Now let me see. In terms of dates, our presentations for November 20th we'll have Joyce, Tamara, Alex, Brian, Robert, and Ivory. If any of you are like, oh my gosh, I had no clue it was so soon, let me know if you're freaking out and we can talk. Then we have Thanksgiving, and then we have December 4th, we have presentations from Andrew, Andrea, Jacqueline, Lynette, and Haley. And then everyone else is turning in an exploration paper, okay? And those will be due, did I ever give you a hard deadline on that?
So I had a question about that.
Yeah.
The rough draft was due on the 20th for the peer review.
Mm-hmm.
Our deadline is due on the 4th.
Wait. Rough draft was due on the 20th for peer review?
Uh-huh.
I have that as November 13th here. I think we're going to stick with the 13th, but like I said, it can be, I'm not grading the rough draft for completeness. So literally if you spend 15 minutes doing it and say, here's what I'm pulling together, and use your, you can pull from your proposal as well. I think that'll still be useful because otherwise, if we do the 20th, what's going to happen is there's actually presentations that day. So let's go ahead with the next week with the idea of, I don't expect these to be done. I don't expect them to be complete in any way. What I had a professor at Northeastern, she called these a zero draft. There's zero expectations. I'm not going to be looking, no one in this class is going to be looking for them to be like complete in any way. It's merely just to help you get stuff done, okay? So what we'll also do is during that time, you can get feedback. So even if you're not fully done with like a draft of it or whatever, you can have an outline, for instance. You could say, you know, I'm really having a hard time of figuring out what I'm going to say in my symposium discussion. So I want to open with this, and you'll have time to like talk it out, or be online and ask questions with your peer group members. So, and I'll get those groups to you very early. I'll work on that before this weekend so that if any of you are like ready to do it now, like you can actually start sharing them. I'll still have an activity that I'll release like in class, but I can actually release that earlier as well. But I do want us to like meet in class so we can talk through some of the stuff that we see in these symposium and exploration papers. The other thing about this symposium that I want to say, so symposium and exploration paper. I'll go to this first. All right, so the symposium presentation. The goal with this is because it's a new theme for everyone, globalization and composition, we're holding the symposiums as a chance to kind of informally but professionally. All right, can anyone tell me what the difference is between, like, you can do something informally but also professionally?
Yeah.
It makes sense? What does it mean though?
It basically means that you're going to be informative when you present it, but you're still going to have all your resources, and basically the presentation is going to be the professional level.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I want it to be professional in the sense of you are prepared, you don't go over time, you
Right.
have a script. I don't necessarily want you to read a script, but I want you to have ideas that you have hashed out. Like, I know I'm going to talk about these 3 things. You have a structure to your presentation, but informal in the sense of you can ask us questions. You can say, one of the things that keeps coming up and I'm not sure what to do with it yet, but I want to think through that is blah, 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 right? Like, you can ask questions, you can say where your ideas aren't fully formed, and it can be informal in that sense. You can ask us for feedback on something. You can say, I'm not really sure what to do with this article, but here's what I'm thinking. But you're still presenting it professionally in the sense of you're still doing the work to think through that idea. Does that make sense? So it's a low stakes presentation where your ideas don't have to be fully formed, but you have to have put in the work to start that work, to start. You'll be in charge of directing class. So either from online, you will Zoom in to us, or if you do it ahead of time, like recording yourself, or in person for about 8 to 10 minutes. And I am going to be very strict on the timing. I'll give you a little leeway, but it will detract if you go more than, 12 minutes, because the point of conferences is you have a small window to say what you want to say. And so your goal is to craft what you want to say in that time frame. Now, one of the things that we can talk about next week is strategically how you make those moves. Like, for instance, what's really good in a presentation is you say, today I want to talk to you about 3 things. Those 3 things are, first, I want to talk about what I understand as globalization. Then I want to talk you through a couple of the key scholars I see in globalization. Third, I want to tell you about this new trend in globalization that I think is blah, blah, blah. So what are you expecting in my presentation if I do that? Those 3 things, right? Like, you set it up structurally and you say, this is my goal for these 10 minutes. All right. So if you do that for us, it's easy to stick in the time frame because you've already outlined, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3. All right. There's a structure. But again, I don't expect you to be experts on these ideas. This is you're thinking through some cool text that you found. I know you haven't read every single thing there is to read on these texts. I don't expect you to. The goal for this symposium is to present what research you've done and how you're understanding your topic. You can do an activity if you have something. I don't know if you want to show a video or if there's something you want to like walk us through. That's up to you. Or it can be a straight like talking. There should be some interactive element in the sense of like we should see something or have a handout, or no one likes to just talk to someone in a presentation. It's a lot of information. So give us some interaction or visual or something. And then symposium presenters should also develop a maximum 2-page single-spaced document that provides a statement or overview of the issue you're discussing, the exigence, why it matters, contextual background, which is the key players, your research questions, your own position, and a bibliography. Guess what? You have a lot of that done in your proposal. You're just kind of reformatting that with the research that you've done. And your research questions are not like, I'm arguing what working class writing is today. You ask questions like, I'm curious about what globalization, how it connects to working class studies, and what working class studies scholarship might tell us about the global impact of literacy. Like, and it can be a thinking through, or I'm curious about X, Y, and Z. They're not research questions that you have to answer. They're merely like, here's what I'm hoping to go forth in the future and think about. What questions you have, we'll talk about the paper in a second, but what questions do you have about the symposium?
Doing a presentation on, I know you don't want an argument, we were very clear on that, but the presentation of material is like an implied argument?
Yeah.
So is that all right?
Yes.
As long as I don't say this is how you think or feel,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
I walk you through specific scholarship in a certain direction and all
Yes.
that implies said argument without making it.
Right.
Okay.
And you can say it at the end. So here I say your own
'Cause it's
position.
citizenship. How do I not?
Yes.
Come on.
So you can have an argument. Everyone's going to have an argument in some way. But this is a different paper than, all right, if you write a seminar paper and you say, I argue that citizenship in the 21st century must be X, Y, and Z. Like, I don't expect you to prove that in 12 weeks. Nothing from this class that you've learned really has given you a space to develop an argument across 12 weeks. We're just kind of thinking about cool ideas that are brand new, and you're pulling some topics. This is a similar genre to like a literature review, maybe a book review. If you're doing comprehensive exams, it's kind of framing your articles, framing your annotated bibliography. You're saying, I'm reading some cool things. Here's what I'm noticing. Here's why I think it's important, and here's where I want to move with it. Okay? Some of you are a little bit further, but I don't want you to focus so narrowly that you can't have all of us engage with the discussion of like the broader questions.
Okay.
Right? So for instance, I don't want a symposium on one article or one text or one music video or one author, because that doesn't give us the broad scope. I want us to be able to, remember when I was talking about key terms, I want us to kind of have that umbrella of, all right, our big umbrella is globalization. Smaller umbrella is maybe multilingualism, or smaller umbrella is citizenship. Okay, well then what's the smaller umbrella? Okay, maybe it's digital technology. Maybe it's protests. Maybe it's translingualism and these things. Okay, here's five people I've read, and here's kind of how I'm tracking that, right? Like, you're starting up top, where in an argument paper, you start with, here's my argument, and I've read these 3 sources, and let me tell you about them. You're kind of giving us the fuller picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I always tell people to think of it like, if you're in a film, you're like zooming out to the very like beginning, as opposed to zooming into a scene. An argument is like one little scene, and you're kind of like giving us the overview of the video, the overview of the film, like that broader picture. All right, for the exploration paper. Oh, well, actually, let me go to this slide really quick. Just a reminder, stay within timing, no more than 10 minutes. I'll give you a couple minutes leeway, but stick to 10. Have a script ready, even if you don't read it. This is, I understand that people present differently. It's boring if you just sit up here and you look at your script the whole time and you don't engage with us, because then you're very monotone and you're just looking at your hands, right? Like, that's kind of boring. So have a script ready if you're nervous and like you want, you know, kind of those guidelines, but try to talk it out with us. If you can't, that's okay. If you're nervous and you really do need to stick to your script, that's okay. Just try and practice it so you're like looking up at your audience a bit. Make sure your scope is appropriate. That was my comment to Brian. And this is something I've commented on a lot of people. If I'm worried about the scope, I've given you some feedback of like how to kind of zoom in or zoom out. All right. The goal is actually a broad framing of a topic. Okay. Each of you, and then the other thing is each of you have chosen something that connects to our class, but you should be reading extra things for it. And those extra things, some of you are using blogs, some of you are using music videos, some of you are using articles about music videos or articles about blogs or articles about citizenship or about identity in some way. But I actually want to know, you can of course cite the things from class, but I should be able to see in your symposium that you've done work that I haven't assigned, okay? And I don't expect it to be extensive. I don't expect you to be reading books on books on books on books, but I should have a sense of like this scholarship. And most of you have already done this in your bibliography. You've already showed me, here's the things I'm thinking about. And even when you present those to us, even if you have, for instance, a book that you haven't read, but you read the intro, tell us that. I don't expect you to have read every book, all the books, right? Say, you know what, just this week I saw this book on Precarious Rhetorics by Wendy Hesford, and I didn't get a chance to read it. I just read the introduction, but here's what I take away from it. That's fine. That's another sense what I mean informal of like, they don't have to be fully formulated ideas. You're just kind of, you're making connections for us and showing how you're giving your thinking. Okay? All right. The exploration paper it's similar to the symposium. It's just people not presenting. It's chosen with me, which you've done to your research proposals. And the basic premise is to explore a theory of composing, which is pretty much anything, connected to globalization. But you're writing a 6 to 8 page double-spaced topic. The same thing with exploration paper. I don't want an argument. I want the same thing as a symposium project where you're giving that broad overview, you're connecting us to key ideas, you're kind of delving into a couple of them, and you're giving the exigents, the key players, your research questions, your own position, and a bibliography. But you're doing that with a little bit more substance. This is kind of, newsflash, if you wrote the script of your symposium presentation, it would probably be about the length of the exploration paper. A little bit less. So about 10 minutes talking is about 5 double-spaced pages. You're kind of doing the same work, but differently presented.
It was a trick all along.
Imagine that. I thought through this a little bit. But they are different because some people like talking things out and some people like really crafting the writing, right? Questions, concerns, freakouts.
Just for the symposium, just a rough source count you're looking for us to have dealt with. I know you asked for somewhere around, it looks like plus or minus 10 on the draft we submitted.
Yeah, I think 10's a good number in the sense of some of those are going to be from our class, right? I want to see you engaging with a number of sources outside of what I've given you. But like I said, I don't expect you, if you have 10 books and you say, oh, here's 10 books on globalization, I don't expect you to have read all of them, but I expect you to have done at least enough research to say, oh, there's a lot of books on globalization, right? Or no one talks about this, right? So I'm not really looking for a number, but 10's a good, I think you can find a lot of trends with the reading we've done for class and then pulling some from that and then crafting together 10 total. I think that would be possible. But again, it's not like a pass or fail, like if you have 10. If you have 3 or 4, probably not adequate.
I wasn't looking for a floor, I was looking for more of a ceiling.
More?
I was looking for more of a ceiling on this. Like when should I
keep going.
Well, because and to be fair, a lot of the books, all the books I cited, with the exception of the new one that she's just put out, I've read in Dr. Carter's lab.
Yeah.
So
some of you,
those to me don't count because I've already read them, right? They don't,
right.
You didn't assign them, but they were assigned to me. So for me to put them on yours like they're extra work isn't fair because it wasn't extra work.
Right.
It was my assignment in and
That's just working smart, though.
Well, it just makes the list longer. I mean, there are things on here that were separate from both courses.
Yeah.
But that's a smaller number.
Yeah. I'm perfectly fine. If you have pages and pages of sources, I will look at the bibliography because the goal is I know some of you, I know you and Joyce and others are working towards dissertations. So that's a different scope than if this is your one-off composition class that you're like, I'm done with this. I hate this topic. Please don't hate this topic. That would like really make me sad. But no one's going to be done with this class. But if you're like, oh, maybe this is a one article or something that I do, and then I'm done with it for a little while, and I come back to it because I love it so much. It might not be so extensive. Right? Okay. How do you feel about this symposium or this exploration paper?
Feeling good about it.
Good.
Better now that I know that it's just one of them. Because in somewhere I got confused with the rough draft. I had to provide a rough draft and a symposium presentation. So I thought the rough draft was like a paper as well as a presentation.
And also, so for your rough draft for next week, it can be either, say you're doing the symposium presentation, you can give us your script, like here's what I want to think through. You can give us an outline, that's fine. Or you can try and write your 2-page single-spaced document that you're actually developing that's a little bit tighter, right? Like that's the thing I'm looking for, like, are you doing good writing, right? But again, you can, I shouldn't say this, I'm being recorded. I don't care about plagiarizing myself. You did this work for this class, pull the sentences you already wrote for my class and put them in your next paper, right? Like pull the sentences you like from your research project proposal that work and put it in this next part. If you have stuff from your response paper that is a summary from Jay Dolmage's work, pull that from a response paper and put this in. And I expect some revision to it, so like tweak it, make it better, but use the work you've done already, okay? And the rough draft, so the rough draft can be any of that, right? It just depends on what you want to call your rough draft for next week. If it's an outline, so be it. Okay. Other questions?
Number one, I want to thank you for clarifying, because that's one reason why I'm on tonight, is to make sure that I understand exactly what number one is due and how we should present it. And I appreciate that. My question is, if we're presenting that like in PowerPoint form, or if I have like a quick fact sheet or something, is there any way I send that to you to have copies made, or for the class is what I'm asking, or how do you want to do that? Or do you want me to upload it somewhere?
For the actual presentation or for next week?
For the actual presentation.
Yeah, I'll have a discussion forum where and I can actually open that up now, where it will say, final symposium, and you can upload all the documents, so I can have it on the screen when you're talking through, but people can also access them individually.
Excellent. And just for reclarification, this is my last really question, is minimum of 10 references?
Yeah, sure. Let's make 10 a minimum. Why not?
Okay.
And some of those you're going to be pulling from my class.
Right. I knew that.
Right?
I knew that. Yes, ma'am.
So, sure. I don't know.
Okay. Here's my B part of that. Can I use an interview as part of my resource? Yes? Yes, absolutely. You can use a podcast. You can use a blog. You can use, I do want a lot of these to be academic sources. Yes, ma'am.
There's academic blogs. There's academic interviews. There's academic podcasts, right? So,
yes, ma'am.
And again, they should be rhetoric and composition based, but there's so many of those. on that spectrum.
Okay.
So, and I do want to apologize to everyone if any of this has been unclear. I don't even know if all of you knew this or not. I had this class developed in 3 formats. I had it as, it was initially a face-to-face class that got moved to an online class that then got moved back to a face-to-face, and then at the last minute got moved to dual modality. So the syllabi that I have, I did not initially have these 2 projects, and then I molded them because I'm like, not everyone's going to present in person. So if there's clarity issues, I do apologize, but that's kind of the emergence of these, is I melded together multiple drafts of this syllabus to come up with how people can participate here and not here, and from like different parts of the world, apparently, because people are Skyping in from all over. Andrew's in the Philippines right now. Hi, Andrew, when you watch this. So hopefully that comes together. Okay, that's what I have on the symposium and project. The other things I have for today, ideally, I hope we get out here early. That's my plan for us. It won't be too early, but maybe like by 9:30 we'll be done. I'm gonna talk to you through a couple ideas, and then we're gonna listen to Andrew's presentation of my article. And I gotta tell you, I had a real thinking through of, man, like, it's always weird when you read your professor's article and writing, and feel free to comment if something's unclear. Like, it's not gonna bother me. I'll tell you, I'll explain it or not explain it, or whatever. But because no one else talks about this research, I thought it was important to give you my article too, because I think I'll talk you through my ideas, but I think I also present them differently in writing. I hope my goal with my writing is that hopefully it's accessible. Hopefully you read it and you're like, oh, I understood that. Maybe more so than other articles. That's my goal with my writing. If it's not, feel free to ask me questions. We're going to actually talk about it, so don't feel like I can't say anything negative about this because it's her article. It's not going to offend me. If it did, I wouldn't write stuff, because you're always getting comments back on it. So I just want to frame a couple ideas before I go into Andrew's presentation of it, and then my own talking through of my research. But one of the things that we have not talked a lot about, we talked about it a little bit with Ralph Centrone, and maybe some other texts, but we haven't really talked about how methods and methodologies connect to this class. And I thought that would be interesting to just frame for you, because I think one of the things that I do, I actually teach the methods and methodologies class here. I'm also really interested in methods and methodologies. And the reason for that, if you read my article, is because I had to kind of build my own method. And I had to, I call it a method of precarity. I had to kind of work my way through building an archive. Like, how do you actually design an archive? How do you build it? How do you fund it? I didn't have, if you build it, they will come, and this like magical thing happened. Like, I had to work on each step and like make things happen, right? But with that, I also engaged in a lot of other methods. So for instance, I don't explicitly call my work ethnography, but I've spent 7 years working with, going to people's houses, interviewing people, doing archival research, doing focus groups. I would very much call it an ethnography. I just haven't, because I didn't anticipate that. It just kind of happened. But I take notes on my meetings. I take, kind of field notes. I do interviews. In 1302, we teach, artifact analysis and interviews and field notes. And I do all those things which are characteristic of an ethnography. And that's what Ralph Centrone's book, Angelstown, he used ethnographic methods. I also engage in community partnership work, which there's particular methodologies that are important for community partnership work. And now that I say that, I realize that some of you might not know the difference between methods and methodologies. Joyce was in my methods class. Does anyone in here know the difference between methods and methodologies? Oh, Alex, go.
The way Dr. Stewart explained it in 599 is the method is what you're actually doing to collect the data. The methodology is the lens through which you're interpreting the data.
Yeah, absolutely. So methods are more action oriented, and they're like the how-to, like how do you build an archive? How do you do an ethnography? What steps do you take? Where the methodologies are more the theoretical framework and the background of what does it mean to do this work, right? So where that gets a little funny sometimes is, for instance, feminist methods and methodologies. There are a lot of people who write about feminist methodologies, and they might say like a feminist methodology respects women's agency. A feminist methodology believes in the idea of reciprocity, and a feminist methodology believes in the idea of doing research that privileges women's voices and does these things, right? Like, it might have all these things, but then if you ask someone, so like, what's a feminist method? They might say, well, I do interviews. But interviews can also be not a feminist method, right? Or an ethnography could be feminist, but it could also not be feminist. So there's difficulties with methods sometimes of like, well, what is a feminist method? What is an ethnographic method? Because if you do interviews in an ethnography, well, you can also do interviews that are not part of an ethnography. So are they ethnographic methods, or is it a method that you use in an ethnography? Do you see the distinction? It's confusing. All that to say, the biggest thing with methods, I think, is to outline for your readers or for whoever you're working with if you're not a scholar, but you want to explain to someone like how you did something. If you took a poll, like, to be explicit about it. Here's what I did and here's why. And if you want to call it something, then go ahead and say that. But if you don't want to name it like an interview or an ethnography, then don't use that terminology. Okay? And then decolonial methodologies. I actually don't specifically call my work decolonial, but a lot of people have actually asked me to write about my work as decolonial. And I haven't, because I thought, well, if I don't specifically, again, this question of naming, if I don't specifically study decolonial methodologies, is it really fair if I call my work decolonial? Like, that, to me, doesn't really match up. Or, to give you a more specific example, although I do believe I do feminist methodologies and feminist methods, the people who I write about wouldn't always classify themselves as feminists. So is it fair for me to call my project feminist if I'm working with community members who are part of this project who don't call themselves feminists? Does that make sense? Right, so there's an issue of naming that goes along. And all that is really complex, but it kind of gives us a little insight of like really being clear with what you're saying. I think the people we've read this semester do a really good job, starting with Kate Vieira and Rebecca Lorimer-Leonard's work. Like, they say, transnationalism is this, and here's how we're framing it, right? Globalization is this, and here's how we're framing it. Like, they do a really good job of naming, defining their terms and their methods and their methodologies. My research for this work, it kind of pulls together literacy and composition and rhetoric, writing studies, which are all pretty much the same thing, but they're called different terms. Different people call them different things. I also study working class identity and labor studies, community engagement, archives, and historiography, and then transnational literacies. And then this, I'm pretty sure I showed you all this slide before, but one of the real important questions I keep coming back to in my research is that questions or statements is that literacy happens across borders and it has material consequences for people. So that happens across geographic and linguistic borders, gendered borders, racial borders, class borders, and then educational borders. And of course there's more, but those are the ones that really kind of come up in my research. Okay, so hopefully this will play, and this is Andrew's presentation, and he did apologize. He is overtime. He gets his overtime right now, not for his symposium, but over the presentation time, but we'll let it slide.
I'm going to be discussing or rather summarizing, Dr. Jessica Pauschek's Writing from the Wrong Class, Archiving Labor in the Context of Precarity. And before we start, I wanted to begin with this photograph here, which, in my opinion, shows the overall atmosphere for this particular paper. And most importantly, the theme, which is kitchen table ethos. And you can see here there are a group of individuals discussing what appears to be different papers to be included in the archival project over tea and biscuits. And everybody seems to be having a very close and warm discussion. You even have somebody laughing and smiling over here off to the side. So it shows that there's a sense of family. And I really felt like within this paper that there was a lot of passion involved with this project, and wanted to start with an idea or sense of what that entailed. I believe this individual here is Sally Flood, who is mentioned quite a bit in this particular paper. So for the summary, in this text, Dr. Jessica Pauschek discusses the importance, difficulties, and effects of archiving written works. Particularly, Pauschek discusses the process of curating a transnational archive for writings made by working class citizens through kitchen table ethos. The text also illustrates the adversity faced by the archivists and curators when collecting and categorizing the aforementioned writings. Furthermore, the text describes how precarity affected the archival project and the working class individuals such as Sally Flood, who were faced with constant hardships, either being told that either their writings were a waste of time or that their writings had no solid literary merit. Ultimately, it is these writings and individuals that brought together a transnational community to preserve the various histories of working class individuals in England. And this is a glimpse of the archive and Dr. Pauschek and various students working around the archive. So some of the key words that were involved were kitchen table ethos, as I mentioned, and a description of that is a sense of community or inclusivity within a group shared often across a kitchen table or within the vernacular spaces of home, a place of shared respect and belief that all people should be heard. And it's throughout the paper, much of the warmth and the community revolves around this type of ethos, where everybody is willing to be heard. And you know, when you think of a kitchen table, you think of family members coming together to enjoy something. And in this case, it's the archiving of working class citizens' work. You've also got the FWWCP/FED, and this is the Federation of Worker Writers and Community Publishers, which was a community-based writing group who helped and allowed working class individuals to share and discuss their writings, as well as facilitate with self-publication. And the FED is essentially an offshoot or modern version of the FWWCP, which doesn't quite exist anymore. And the FED holds this FWWCP legacy at heart, but more so as an online presence, which does have writing workshops and writing festivals every now and then. And then we have the FWWCP Archival Project, which is a transnational community and group of individuals who came together to assist with the curation and preservation of the FWWCP works, mouthful, and as well as other works that involved working class individuals in the England area. Then we have a precarity and general definition is a state of existence in which material provision and psychological wellness are adversely affected by lack of regular or secure income. But in this particular paper, Dr. Pauschek states that precarity for this project is, or rather represents, the interrelated economic, material, and spatial instability that permeates working class writers and texts, as well as the effects that often correspond with social, educational, and political marginalization in their lives. So in the context of this text, it refers to how individuals in the working class were exploited by being forced to work in an unstable and unstable working conditions and writing conditions, and then the economic restructuring by governmental powers in and around 1979 to 1990 ended up creating a negative social attitude towards these working class individuals, thus hindering them from being able to successfully archive their own work and seek out funding for their work prior to the FWWCP's archival project intervention. And then you have transnational, which we all know. I unfortunately don't have enough time to go over these, but we're pretty familiar with what these are. Accessibility, working class, and we have sponsorship. And I felt that this was kind of important because Deborah Brandt, of course, discusses this as any agent, local or distant, concrete or abstract, to enable, support, teach, model, as well as recruit, regulate, suppress, or withhold literacy and gain advantage by it in some way. And I felt that in this particular text, the archival practices made by the archivists when choosing how to archive, categorize, and promote the various works being submitted was all a means of a positive sponsorship. So these are some of the words in a word cloud, and as you can see, community was one of the biggest ones. And of course, you have archive and Sally and London literacy, a few others. And so one of the quotes that I felt really embodied what this entire paper was about was, as such, and it kind of has a lot of power behind it. And you see the quote is, the tearing up of Sally's poems becomes a metaphor for the ephemerality of working class voices unknown. What then does it mean not only to listen to, but also to archive these stories? Together, these texts epitomize the lived experience of the FWWCP and Fed and shape the values brought into preservation. These values draw attention to how communities respond to precarious conditions that often erode such working class history rather than promote it. The FWWCP archival project shows us how stories like Sally's might travel from a poem on scrap paper written in a factory decades ago to her kitchen table to a transnational community archive. And this is a shot of the archive off to the side here. It's much, much larger than this. I think I have another photograph of it in the previous slide, and you can probably see much more of it online. And then you've got this quote here, which in its broadest sense, the FWWCP developed a kitchen table ethos, appealing to a sense of community or inclusivity within a group, shared often across a kitchen table or within the vernacular spaces of home. So again, with the keyword that I mentioned earlier, this kitchen table ethos manifests more specifically in a shared feeling of empowerment, agency, and confidence through writing as a part of a group that believes in the power of storytelling for disenfranchised people, regardless of traditional education, gender, race, nationality, or even ability to read and write. And this is kind of a common theme throughout some of the other papers that we've just been reading through this class, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. In fact, Sally noted that during these meetings and performances, members could vehemently disagree with one another, and yet whenever they shared their writing, everybody applauded, understanding the importance of telling your story. And then here's a picture of Sally when she was younger during the working class days. I believe it was 1941 when this was taken, and this is a little bit more modern than the past couple of years, I believe. So the quote here is, most of our FWWCP writers come from poorer districts and they can tell a very different story. When we first started writing, they told us that it wasn't literacy because it was coming from the wrong class, and we proved them wrong. To further explain this friction, Sally recounted that when the FWWCP requested Arts Council funding, they were emphatically told that their organization had no solid literary merit. Within Sally's history, the interplay of governmental power as well as social economic influence deeply impact perceptions of literacy. And in her stories, institutions and individuals/groups often position the working class as lacking intellectually. And I'll go on in a bit to discuss some other, another paper that has a connection here. So, of course, we have, as far as connections with other works that we've read throughout the semester, Deborah Brandt's Sponsors of Literacy is one of the major ones. And of course, you have, with Dr. Pauschek's piece, it discusses different aspects of sponsorship, particularly the discussion that the archival project became a sponsor for the works that were being created for these working class individuals, such as Sally Flood. And so the archival project took into deep consideration the type of categorizing that was being done so as not to misinterpret or marginalize these writers that they were archiving. And as I mentioned earlier, they ended up becoming positive sponsors as such. Then you have J. Dolmage's Disabled Upon Arrival. And while this isn't necessarily about physical appearances, many of the immigrants in Dolmage's piece were placed into the wrong class, similarly to Sally Flood, and how she was incorrectly discriminated against and demeaned solely based off of her working class. And similarly, with Dolmage's piece and Ellis Island, a lot of the individuals that came through were discriminated and marginalized and put into lower classes simply because of how they looked. And they were treated as inferiors, similarly to Sally Flood. Then you have Timothy Daughtry's Knowing Your Story, or Our Story. And the connection here was finding one's own story through the process of researching and understanding another's history. And in writing from the wrong class, we can see that Dr. Pauschek has a further connection and deeper connection with these individuals in England due to her own family being a part of the working class when she and they grew up. So this history was able to help her develop a special connection, I feel, with the individuals and their writing in this archival project. And then you have Wendy Hesford and Eileen Schell's Configurations of Transnationality. And a big theme in this is transnationalism or transnationality. And in Hesford and Schell's paper, it was described as there's a quote, that I really enjoyed that kind of paired well with this paper that we just read, in that it states, a transnational rhetorical perspective, however, strives to address how rhetorical concepts are shaped by cultural, social, and economic interconnectivities and interrelations and cross-border and cross-cultural mobilizations of power, language, resources, and people. And so in Dr. Pauschek's piece, much of the rhetoric in the text is shaped by economic and political mobilizations, as well as individual, cross-border, and cross-cultural mobilizations. We can see different faculty members and students coming from the U.S., particularly Syracuse University, and assisting with the archival project and offering their own funding to assist with this said archival project. And furthermore, it discusses how individuals were prevented from expressing their own words and writings due to political and economic marginalization. And so, as an ending point, I kind of wanted to show a poem by Sally Flood as an example of the type of works that are being archived. And I hope I do it justice and read it correctly. So this is the Brick Lane I See. Brick Lane is a mixture of aromatic spices, curries, onions, and bad drains, Pakistani restaurants, Jewish trimming shops, and bedding shops. Down-at-heel workers and hopeful prostitutes, cars and vans add to the pollution with heavy exhaust fumes. Pavements and gutters are littered with overspill from dust bins and workshops. This is where the immigrant looks for fulfillment. This is the breeding ground for discontent, where the meth drinker mixes with the down and out, where workers are exploited and small-time drug peddlers sell their dreams. This is where the thug dons the crown of king and bullies thrive, where do-gooders salve their consciences. This is Brick Lane. I hope I did enough justice for this. I'm sure Dr. Pauschek will discuss her piece further. It was a beautifully written piece, and I really enjoyed the amount of personal experiences that were placed into this paper, and it kind of goes along with the theme that we've been experiencing thus far in class with these wonderful pieces that are being written, and they incorporate their own personal trials and tribulations and hardships, as well as successes. So thank you very much. Hope you all have a great evening.
Well, Andrew made me feel good about my work. We can clap for him. That wasn't the goal, but it's really interesting to hear other people's perceptions of your work, because even though I teach Dolmage and Hesford and Shell, and I actually just presented at a conference about transnational stuff, I have never written about Dolmage and Hesford and Shell in a paper with my work, and I'm like, why haven't I? Now I have like these ideas for another article. So thank you, that's cool. All right, so I want to stop a little bit for a couple minutes of discussion, and then I'll kind of walk you more through the archive. But what stands out to you all about the FWCP text or my article, like the histories about the Fed? Like what struck you as interesting or unique, confusing, any of those?
Look at this kitchen table ethos the other way. I mean, immediately my head goes to, because I hear it in politics all the time, kitchen table issues, kitchen table issues, kitchen table issues. And for me, I mean, I remember, just on a personal note, that not in the same vein at all, but I mean, we ate dinner when my dad came home, and there was that. That's when you'd hear your parents talk about the electric bill. That's when you hear, right? So that connection, to me, I remember that growing up. And I still hear it today, and I don't know if when they say it or when I read it in articles, if people are making that connect, like what they're talking about anymore, if that's even a thing anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. It really strikes me, when I was a kid, we sat around a kitchen table, same thing, like when my dad got home from work, and then kind of stopped. But when I go to England, it's like when we have the picture that Andrew showed was a picture of a Fed executive meeting, and that's what it looks like. We sit around the table, we have food. Lucia is, Sally Flood is usually there.
I'm going to
get in bigger picture. Okay, this is Sally Flood. Here we're at, actually it's called the Quakers Meeting House. So it's a Quakers center. This is Lucia, you kind of see her in the back. She always makes homemade Victoria sponge cakes for me because they're my favorite. This is Louise. Louise takes a train we're in Stevenage, which is a little bit, 15 minutes outside of London. Louise comes down from Lancashire area, I think. It's called the Midlands. This is Roy, Lucia's husband. Roy at the time was the Fed chair. He's just like a lovely human being. This is Ashley. She's from Brighton, which is southeastern England. This is Roger Mills, which you might have seen some of his writing. And then this is Dave. Dave is originally from Scotland, way, way, way up in Scotland, and now lives in Newham, which is London. But this is very typical. People are gathered around a table. There's fresh fruit. There's biscuits. There's in the kitchen, I guarantee there's a cake that Lucia made. There's always tea. We stop the meeting to have lunch with each other. The meeting will go all day. Like we schedule about 8 hours. The first time I went to a Fed meeting, I thought, why the heck is this 8 hours? I was very confused. And then I realized, like, this is what it means to interact with people, is you sit down and you talk to them and you ask them how they are and how their lives are, how their kids are, their grandkids are. And you actually talk about that, and then you do work as well, and then you eat together. And so like that kind of shaped what I realized meant working with a community, is a different type of like we have 30 minutes to discuss everything and then meet you in 6 weeks,
Yeah.
right? Very different type of meeting. Yeah. So what else sticks out to you? Does anyone else have a different reaction to kitchen table ethos or other ideas of the text?
Well, when I looked at her writings and then the writings of Isaac and Ernestina,
Mm-hmm.
it was interesting that the archive is doing the work to document their histories. And I wrote it in my reading responses. It's because the working class people were kind of being erased.
Mm-hmm.
And like the archive was doing the work of bringing them back to light.
Yeah.
It's kind of how Uncle Tom's Cabin tells the story of how we don't want to see race in America, but the archive did the work that we don't want to see.
Mm-hmm.
How Brick Lane really looks.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And I think too, to go with that is even in the reason I wrote this article specifically was to talk about the work that people don't want to talk about. There is a trend in composition and rhetoric where we talk about these projects that are grandiose and they're exciting. And I'm more of a practical person. Like, how did you do that project? Where'd you get the money for it? Who gave you the funding? Who did the work? How many graduate research assistants did you have? Because I don't have any. Like, how, and I've pitched this article to a couple places and some did not like it. They did not, and they didn't, it wasn't my writing. It was, why are you writing a methodological article about building an archive? Like, why? And I'm like, because we don't talk about how do you fund an archive? How do you get boxes of books from point A to point B? How do you, how do you actually take action against erased histories, right? And so that was like my goal with it, and not everyone bought into it.
Now, why do you think is that? Because of this sort of gatekeeping attitude about archives, or is this because they don't want you to come to them for money, or is this?
My sense is the people who read this negatively, my sense is two things. I mean, academia, you always get critiqued, so I'm used to critiques, but these were different types of critiques. My sense is two things. I think some people don't value community writing, and some people don't want to talk about working class stuff. There's a presumption that, I just read this article again, it's beautiful. 1996, I think, Lynn Bloom wrote an article called Freshman Composition is a Middle Class Enterprise. And she makes the assumption, but it's not even an assumption. She says, we are middle class teachers teaching middle class students how to write like the middle class. I'm like, oh, except if you're not middle class. Like, what? But the field of composition and rhetoric was kind of built on the presumption that one, people are middle class, and two, people want to be middle class, so we're going to teach our students to write standard English that is kind of in some ways a middle class
Not my
version of
understanding of
English.
discipline at all.
But
That's not my understanding of your discipline at all.
think of who your instructors for this discipline have been.
It's not even in the book.
Right? But the fact that we're teaching texts, so that plays into it. You'll have a different view because of the instructors you've had teaching it, right? But the very classical sense of the discipline is very much like a middle class, even maybe elite, like it all. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It assumes you're coming from a certain amount of privilege, even if we don't see it as privilege.
Right. Well, and historically, right, like this wasn't the goal of this class, but if we think historically, right, like we're just by talking about globalization, you already probably wouldn't see this middle class ethos because it's like we're already reading stuff that's on the edges of composition in some ways. But if you look at like the heart of composition and rhetoric, it started at multiple places, but the Dartmouth Conference in 1966, which was a group of pretty much white middle-class men getting together and saying, what is composition? Let us be transnational and bring some people from England. I mean, that's really what it was. And then in the late 1800s, I commented on someone's paper about this, but freshman composition started after the, well, twice kind of throughout history, but first Harvard had an entrance exam, and the Harvard entrance exam, so like Harvard, right, very elite entrance exam, was about who could get into college, and specifically about writing, like who was gifted enough to write for Harvard, right? That was really the basis of how other universities created their entrance exams. Then what happened is that when Mina Shaughnessy wrote a book in the 1970s, I believe, called Errors and Expectations, she was responding to the open admissions process at the CUNY schools, the City University of New York, which was pretty much like, you know, we're giving open admissions. The problem about that was that it introduced different students, different meaning non-white, non-English, solely English speaking, non-standard English speaking students to the university, that all of a sudden CUNY schools started accepting non-middle class students. And it was like, oh my gosh, we're going to have horrible students, right? And so it wasn't until like the late 70s, early 80s that people started talking about, what do we do with these problematic students? I say that very sarcastically, right? And so the field was really based on this idea of like, well, the people in college are the middle class and the elite, and they are good writers already because they're proper writers. And if you go back historically too, composition as a field emerged out of like grammar and correctness, like that. It's called current traditionalism, of like this idea of skill and drill, which Vincent was talking about with Ford. Like you write this sentence and it talks about propriety and morality, but you also write the perfect sentence. Like, I will go to the library. So you're not only teaching about morals, like, oh, it's good that you go to the library and you read because that means you're intelligent. I will go buy a car. Well, that means you are middle class enough to have money to buy a car, right? And so they teach this morality along with teaching the language. And so it became like all of that was kind of ingrained in the discipline in the early years. And then it's kind of broken away from that. But that's really where, if any of you like asked your parents or even your grandparents, like, what did you use as your composition books? They were all current traditional, like how to write appropriately, how to write correctly. And those are still being used. I mean, they're still being used.
I think a lot of times some of the work that is presented as things that we're reading are done like from this ivory tower. Look at me. I'm considering other people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that too.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
It's not like reciprocal community engagement. It's more like.
Well, that's why I like, and this is a broader discussion within the discipline, and I had this discussion a little bit with Dr. Carter last week about how there are books written on these social issues at such a distance because they're trying just to lay this problem out.
Yeah.
And then there's the stuff that I would write, which is in no form or fashion has any kind of distance from any
I'm
of
right
that.
in the middle of
Right.
this.
And she brought up the point that I couldn't dispute, that they don't need to convince me that they're right because I'm probably already on their side. So it might be a little of, like inside baseball, we're all talking about the same thing. But some of them do say this is what you do with the work. I always bring up Garcia and the Writing Center example as one to say, okay, your writing center is racist. Here's how we know it's racist. Here's what you can do about it.
Right.
Cruise
Yeah.
this semester was like, here's how you can integrate what the 4Cs said we should do. Here's how you can practically do it on the ground. Here's how I did it.
Yeah.
So, but they don't all do that.
Right.
Some of them are just like, here's a problem.
Right.
Over 20, 30 years.
Like I was telling you earlier about some of my middle credit classes, they are the privileged middle class students.
Mhm.
And I think that that's how they see a lot of this. Like, oh, you're introducing us to this, and then this, and then this. And I'm like, I'm not just, like, we're approaching it from, like, the students who would be bored.
Right.
I think that's,
Well, and even
yeah.
actually, even what you're saying, so I think, and a lot of you, Skyping in are instructors who have to teach to the STAR test, right? Or you have to teach a certain curriculum. Those curriculums are built around middle class ideas of correctness. And the students who usually don't fit into that are non-standard in some way, right? They're deemed non-standard as, okay, you don't speak good enough English, or you don't speak this, or, well, like working class dialects don't really fit in, or African American vernacular doesn't fit in, or Latinx dialects don't fit in. Like, and all of a sudden those identities through writing are kind of pushed out. Like, you can't pass STAR if you want to include those identities, right? So the idea is you write to the STAR test. Well, the STAR test is written, I'm sorry to say it, by white upper elite men. It's a capitalist test. The test is created to gain money, and it just is this constant thing. But I mentioned this to someone, I think it was Lynette, how as much as I agree that STAR testing is limiting and constricting and constraining, it's not a simple thing we can just say, well, we can't fix it, because like I said, going back to the Harvard entrance exams, people created the Harvard entrance exams that then shaped a discipline. People created the STAR test that is now shaping our current state of education. That's not to say it's easy to get rid of it, but there is a scenario in the world where we get rid of STAR testing. There is. It might not be the most possible thing, but it was man-made, man and woman made, all genders created, right? So people made it. It didn't just appear. And it also was created based on assumptions and ideas of what is correct and what is appropriate ways of speaking and communicating, right? Which are never, ever inclusive of the working class. I can guarantee that.
I have a question in it, and I guess going backward a little bit from what we were discussing.
Mm-hmm.
You said that there were two reasons that you felt like some of this paper got negative feedback, and one of them was because people are maybe not interested in community writing. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's really interesting, and maybe it relates some to the STAR test as well, because I mean, that's not really a community-based test, right? Like that doesn't
Right.
speak to a specific community and what you need to work within there. So I don't know, that community thing is interesting to me. I'm gonna mute out.
Yeah, I mean, so within composition and rhetoric, right? I'm going with the metaphor of zooming in and out a lot today. If you zoom out, the discipline is composition and rhetoric or writing studies or literacy studies, right? And the more you zoom into it, within that, all right, I'm into literacy studies and I'm into community and engagement and community writing. Like those are kind of subfields. And there's a lot of buy-in to community writing, especially since Paula Matthew published her book, Tactics of Hope. I think it was 2005, which is a beautiful, beautiful book. And Paula is one of my very favorite people. And there's buy-in in the subfield now of like, oh yeah, community writing, this is important. But to speak to my broader question of community buy-in, there are still people who, for instance, on my job talks, I will say most of them are literature people in the sense of capital L literature, meaning like canon, right? Shakespeare is the literature canon. Like you cannot diverge from that. People who are very canonical in their arguments. There were people who asked me on my job market talks, well, is the Fed writing good? Do they use correct writing? Can we learn anything from them if they're writing with,
Biscuit.
yeah, misspelling the word biscuit? I had people ask me those questions, and my answer to them usually was, I don't actually care if it's good and correct writing. What I care about is that it's good because it's telling me a story that has otherwise been erased. And it's telling me, like Sally Flood says, it's telling me the truths and the testimony of a class that was already marginalized because of their educational status. So I'm not looking for correctness. I'm looking for the reality and like the documenting of these histories. And that's the most truthful thing you can get. And in that way, it's the best writing for me, right? But that person who asks that question of canon, right, canonical, they're looking for, well, can you teach this Fed text and someone learn how to write the STAR test from this? I'm going to say no, but can they learn about audience from these texts? Yes. Can they learn about different genres of writing? Yes. Can you learn about code meshing? Yes. Can you learn about kind of telling a story and integrating your own voice? Yes. You can learn all these skills with writing, but it won't teach to the test.
Oh, okay, here we go. And it made me think about in that book, Tactics of Hope, she talks about how sometimes when like people from the university go out into the community, they go with this attitude that they're kind of like the savior and they're out to like fix the community. But what I liked about the approach that you did was that you respected the writers and you let them have the choice into what was going to be included. And so I really like that.
Thank you. Yeah. So I mean that like really shaped how I go about my work, because as you said, there's an one of the big problems, and I would say it's related to that middle class discussion. And that's not to say, so I want to make a distinction. Middle class people are not bad people. That's not the issue. The problem, and elite people who have more money are not bad people. The problem is that when we have education set up so that everything is valued through these ideas that you should be middle class, all of a sudden those values become a marker that people hit or they don't. And so it sets up middle class values of morality, if we're going back to Ford, cleanliness. Do you own a car? Do you own a house? Or do you have other people sleeping in your house? Well, who cares if my family shares a house with me, right? But like those were values that people had to hit in terms of morality. Like you can't be middle class if you share a house with your family. You can't be middle class if you don't own a car. You can't be middle class if you don't do these things. So it sets kind of a barrier for, what people can do. To go back to your question of like it's called the savior complex, where you kind of go into the community and you say, I will help you and use my privilege and, tell you that you need saving pretty much. The problem with that is obviously that it's going from this deficit model of there's something to fix out there that I, with my university degree and usually my whiteness, can fix, right? The problem with that, it should be pretty apparent, but it is that deficit model. What community writing, I think, is starting to do, and what I'm trying to do for sure, is that if you look with the asset model, is like that the community can teach you something no matter who you are, right? Because they know more about their own community than anyone else. They also know more about that lived experience. And I think you get that, for instance, like Ralph Cintrone's work, I think, does that really well. I don't think he ever comes across as this savior coming into a community. He writes about his community with respect and has them teach him, what he notices. Do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I wanted to follow up by saying that I saw an application of this at a conference I attended about a week ago, where two professors chose to co-present with their students. And so
Did what?
the professors at this conference, they co-presented with their students. So they brought their students to the conference. And they let the students tell us how we can help them. So I thought that was very relevant, because all this time when we go to professional development, we come up with this idea of how we should help students, but we never give students a voice to tell us how can we help you. And I thought it was, everybody there, their mouth was open and we were listening, and they had something to say, and it was very valuable. And some people were moved to tears by what the students told us. But it was, it's something that I don't think it's done enough to give the students a voice.
Well, and to build off of that, I absolutely, I love that style, and that's like definitely a method of a lot of community engagement. People will do that. The problem, not with that, but the problem of making that happen sometimes is, for example, I went to the Working Class Studies Association conference, which was one of the best conferences I've ever been to. And it was in Kent, Canterbury, England. And I thought, wow, this is going to be the first time that I can present in England with Fed members. But of course, it was going to be hard because many of them are in their 80s and Sally's in her 90s. But I thought, well, this is my opportunity to present alongside the Fed members rather than just talk about them, right? And I use their stories, but it's not the same. And yet I had Paul Nugent from Peckett-Well, and I had Dave Chambers from Newham Writers, and Roy and Lucia Birch were going to go, but they had a family issue come up. But in order for me to get them there, it was absurd, because even though it was a conference the community members were invited to, it cost £270 per person to register, and because your meals are paid. The housing was £65 per night. I ended up using grant money for the Fed members to come, which I was happy to do it, but then it put me in this situation again of they should be able to come to this conference without my financial support from a university. And yet the conference itself, I love this conference, but it didn't enable that to happen. So to get their voices heard, they still had to have sponsorship in the form of finances from other people, because it was so, I can barely afford that type of money as a faculty member, let alone if you're an undergrad or a grad student or a community member, or most of the Fed is a retired community member, right? And so I absolutely agree with you. I think that is an awesome model, but I think that's how far the structure still has to go of enabling those spaces to be inclusive of undergrads and grad students and community members is still a process that's not happening everywhere.
The academic conference talking about the material seems like it needs its own requisite activist nonprofit organization to fundraise for it.
Yeah. And I pointed that out to the people, and they were really generous, and they're like, we recognize that this is a problem. We can only get this university to fund it with these prices. There isn't a way yet. And so they did acknowledge it was an issue. But again,
Of all the places to have that issue, right? That's
yeah. And so it's kind of one of those things that that's still an issue. Now, the conference I just went to a couple weeks ago, the conference on community writing, that was again an issue. However, what they started doing, because people complain, and this is where people voicing their opinions and they're advocating and being activists for themselves, they actually a couple weeks after the conference, or a couple weeks before the conference was going, there was very low attendance numbers. And then they realized that grad students weren't signing up because they couldn't afford it. And so they dropped the grad student price. Like, I'm pretty sure it was free. If not, it was like half of what they proposed. And they did that for community members as well. So they subsidized that, and they kind of said, we'll figure it out. And they have since. But that was a very, like, first it was risky because they could have had to pay a lot of money, you know, make up that money. But it was also a very radical move. In some ways it was an easy move because it's like, of course, why wouldn't you think of that? But it was very radical in the sense of not many conferences do that.
We were talking about that last night in the context of the graduate school here, and issues with money and reimbursement doesn't matter if you don't have it to front. That the, I mean, I'm going in February because my parents can help. That's the only reason. I don't have the money additionally to go.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, if everybody couldn't and no one does, the reputation of the, like, your major export is English teachers here. Like, that's your like, right? That starts to fall off when people stop going to stuff and people stop seeing people from this school here.
Right.
Because of the money.
Remind me about that with CGAD stuff later.
Okay.
Yeah, but absolutely, that has to be.
I am working on.
There has to be a structure for those things.
And
Lieutenant. And I think that goes back to the slide that I started with about methods, right? So there's a lot of people in academia and people get into academia for different reasons. Some people want to talk theory, and they want to teach theory, and they don't want to teach applicability. That's not me, right? But there are certain people who in the academy, like, that is what they live for, right? But going back to Jacqueline's question and Jennifer's question, I think when I talk about community writing, I think that's also a disconnect of why some people maybe will always be critical of my work. I don't know. I don't take it personally because it wasn't an argument about my writing. It was just they didn't seem interested in the type of argument I was making, or the importance that argument even has to be made. And I think there's people who, if they come from, the realm of privilege and they haven't had to kind of go through those steps, or for instance, if you work at a Research One university and you don't have to worry about funding, you don't have to worry, do your students get funding or not? Like, that's so far removed from what you're thinking because you have it. Why would you have to think about how to build an archive when you don't have money if you have the money to do it? Right? And that's not their fault. It's just a difference of perspective. Other questions or thoughts about these texts?
Yes. If Sally was not able, when you were making the comment about from a mechanical perspective, could we criticize her text? If she was not able to write her ideas down, physically able to write her ideas down, it would be recorded. Just like lost languages.
Yeah.
So it's just
Well, and so, and I get what you're getting at for sure. I wrote an article a couple years back about Peckinwell and the biscuit politics.
Yeah,
it's called.
that.
Right, and so that article is about specifically a group in the Fed called Peckinwell College. And they named themselves a college because they were working class people who didn't go to college, and they said, we're going to build our own college and tell everyone else that we can do it too. And they were people who, many of them were in the traditional sense illiterate, but of course they had multiple literacy skills. But in the reading and writing sense, many of them were illiterate. And what they did is they had writing hands. And so if I'm your writing hand, you would dictate to me and I would write it word for word as you say, and then we would work through it together and I would tell you. And they wrote books like that with a writing hand, or they recorded it and transcribed it. And so exactly, it's no different than recording oral languages that are not preserved, you know, and it goes back to our discussion with Cushman's article and Sequoian, right? And the Cherokee syllabary of like what happens if they didn't have the Cherokee syllabary, or if they didn't preserve it, you know, orally, like how those languages get lost, really, and those histories get lost. So I'm just going to work through a couple. This will go, these slides will go fast because we already know this stuff, but I wanted to just set up a couple things. One of my goals with this class, I realize that everyone is going to a PhD or a dissertation, but I think it's important to like understand how your projects can evolve, no matter if you're doing a dissertation or a book, or if you just have this side project in your high school or your middle school, like it evolves. And you might start with one question and then it, you know, changes. So I wanted to show you what I started with. I started with, for my dissertation, how do working class communities deploy literacy and engage in meaningful rhetorical acts? And that was my main question, and then I have these other ones like, how do community-based rhetorical acts expand and challenge disciplinary histories? And who can participate in knowledge creation and literacy efforts? That goes to your question right there of like, who can create knowledge? Do you have to be able to write to create knowledge? I don't think so. How might these moments of community-based agency speak more broadly across disciplines and contexts as we think about how marginalized communities use literacy for social change? And those were my research questions. And then, you know, I started working with the Federation of Worker Writers and Community Publishers, which started with 8 groups, and then some of this you'll know from the article, but some of it's just to clarify and reiterate. They expanded beyond London and England to 100 international groups at least. For instance, when I was working in the archive, I found applications from South African groups, which this was before the internet. They were writing, and I have their letters that said, "Dear Stephen, we read something by one of your writers, and our group meets in South Africa every Friday, and we would love to be part of your federation. I'm including a book for you to read. Please let us know if we can apply to your federation." This was from South Africa in the 1980s, writing a letter to London, and then like 6 weeks later, they get another letter that says, "Okay, here's our application," and you get to see how people across countries. So there's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the US, Italy, Germany, Spain, France, Scotland, Ireland. I mean, there are many, many countries. And then South Africa. The one place I haven't found groups connected to was specifically in Asia. But what's interesting is there are many, as you read some text, Asian immigrant communities who were forced out of Asia for various reasons, then locating in London and writing about Asia. Whether it was Bangladesh, we have Bengali women writers, we have people from the Middle East coming from Iran, the Iranian in exile example. We have people coming from India, Pakistan, you know, all over. So maybe they didn't have groups in those countries. Maybe they did, but I don't have evidence of it. But I definitely have evidence of them coming to England and writing about their homes, which I think is pretty cool. If you think that all happened before digital technologies. Some of the other really big background stuff, and I wrote about this in the article, but there's, you know, decades. I think this is really relevant today because while I won't go on a rampage on politics, I think a huge reason Donald Trump was elected was because many working class people felt like they had enough and they didn't feel heard. And that's saying something. And working class people of all races, but specifically white working class people. And I think so there's similarities in the time period of what was happening in the 1970s. And then kind of today of like deindustrialization and how people respond to that, unemployment rates, decades of conservative politics. This was when Margaret Thatcher was in power, which I don't know how much you all know about Margaret Thatcher, but I didn't realize until I started studying in England how much hatred there was for Margaret Thatcher by so many people. They actually, after her funeral, people wrote like all over the streets of London in graffiti, like "Ding Dong, the witch is dead." And that was the song "Ding Dong, the witch is dead" from Wizard of Oz rose to #1 on the charts as a like final send off to Margaret Thatcher, which I think is horrible and kind of hilarious. And like there was a lot of, when we talk about class tension, that was it. There's also, this goes back to when I said middle class values and middle class ideals. Again, it's not that middle class people are bad. It's this assumption of middle class values. Yeah.
I want to call it a misconception now, is that middle class at this point became the default.
Mm-hmm.
Like
absolutely.
If you're not in it, it's where you aspire to be, but it also becomes the baseline, not just in composition and rhetoric, but as a practical matter on a day-to-day out in the world. Like that's, no one ever, it's middle class values. It's aspiring to the middle class. No one's running around saying aspire to upper class or aspire to, it became a vernacular for just like sort of where you can, like a hard cap on.
Yeah.
Acceptable percentage.
Yeah.
It's so, yeah, absolutely. And so one of the ways that happened was Margaret Thatcher, and then even after Thatcher, many years later in our lifetimes, Tony Blair, they use the phrase, we're all middle class now. And that is still, I was looking on Twitter very quickly because I was appalled, to be honest. Like my jaw dropped when I read this. So I followed many. I don't actually follow them because I don't want to give them my likes like any politicians, but I like look at a lot of different politicians, many different politicians. Nancy Pelosi, her Twitter actually says, Speaker of the House, focused on strengthening America's middle class.
Yeah, that's
so, and it ties into our discussion of neoliberalism, of like this idea of like we just assume people are middle class and want to aspire to it.
And it's a way to not talk about that fact by only addressing the middle class. It ignores everything underneath it. You don't have to say, no one says lower class. If you're almost embarrassed to address it, intent, like it's the default, it's the minimum standard of American society. It's middle class and up. But there's this whole other spectrum of people.
Absolutely, there's even more of a spectrum.
To fit everybody, so no one has to be underneath it. Because
so there is working class that they're like, oh no, they're middle class.
Lower
like,
middle
oh, no,
class.
Lower middle.
Right.
Well, and now there's like economics are so distributed that there's David Harvey has this fantastic lecture where he talks about the precariat, which the proletariat class used to be, in this time of the 1970s, it was the workers, right? They had unions, they had, these things, you worked and then you retired and like maybe you didn't have a lot, but you lived. Like that's where my grandparents were. It was kind of like this proletariat class of like the working class. They didn't have much, but they had maybe some security in the sense of if you put in your as many years as you could, you might be okay. But then beyond that, after deindustrialization, and with now our generation, whoever is like growing up today, currently, so it's not just one generation, it's multiple generations. There's below the proletariat is now the precariat. That, for instance, you could have a college educated degree. I'm a professor, I have a PhD, And yet I don't really consider myself middle class because I have so much student loan debt that I'm in a precarious position that if I don't get tenure, if I don't have this job, I can't pay my debt off, right? And so that puts me, sure, maybe I'm earning middle class money-ish, but I'm not in a middle class status
So far behind.
because you start so far behind. And that's what David Harvey calls the precariat of like, we are now entering the stage where even middle class positions are now in precarious positions. And then there's even what people call underclasses of that. Like, what is the working poor? I hate the term underclass because it signifies somehow like lesser, but they're saying solely like economically and in terms of the people who are not talked about. Like, so there's service workers who are now part of precariat. Adjuncts are part of the precariat because you might have a job as a teacher within MA.
You brought that up, service workers though, because recently they were talking about Las Vegas on the news, and that their strongest union in the city is food service workers.
Yeah,
so it's not that it can't be done.
that's true. Yeah,
but that's the only one, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's not to say that all. I mean, there's some service work that's pretty stable, right? But there's different designations. But so it's definitely, if you get a chance, listen to David Harvey. He also is the one who wrote the book on neoliberalism that I told you about. But he does a really good job of showing just how wide these discussion of classes are. And what's interesting is we don't talk about class in America. When you go to England, for instance, Sally Flood will tell you that people would call her, names because of working class because they could tell from her accent. She spoke Cockney, or she was from the East End, which was a working class city, or a working class part of the city, and so she spoke a working class dialect. You don't really have that here. Maybe the assumption is people from like a southern rural dialect, maybe that's the assumption, is that they're working class, but it doesn't fit, right? It doesn't fit in terms of the stereotype or because you could have people from Detroit who are working class and people from the rural South who are upper class. Yeah. It doesn't fit. But in England, dialect does play a really big, again, it's not guaranteed, but it does play a big role in how people designate their classes. For instance, the article about biscuit politics I was talking about with Peckett-Well, in Yorkshire, if someone says me mum instead of my mom, you would know that they were working class. Me mum is a non-standard variety of British English that you wouldn't say that unless you were like from a working class family. And so you could tell like in your language. This is Sally. These are her writings. One of the questions we've talked about today that made me think of this, Sally's writing, interestingly, right, like she didn't graduate high school, she left school, she was an embroidery machinist. She started writing later in life. She was finally able to quit school, or to quit her job and then write for a living because people hired her to be a reminiscence teacher, which is like reminiscence is like telling your story, your like memoir writing and stuff like that. And then interesting enough, her writing is now on one of the tests in England that's like our STAR test or whatever. It's on one of their tests. And I'm like,
so you can tell the people at that job.
You can go back there now and tell them.
But it's so ironic that they don't even they're reading it as like, this is this working class writing, and like reading it as like, like we might read, Mark Twain or someone that it's good and it's interesting, but they're not reading it in the context that she wrote it in, realizing like this is a woman that you've kind of pushed out of academia and education and now is writing this thing that you're using on your tests, right? And I just love, right, obviously my title comes from her, writing from the wrong class. These are different people. These are people from Peckett-Well. This is Billy Cryer and Florence Agba, if you read her work. Florence is from Ghana. and immigrated, and she would have called herself illiterate, and she wrote now 2 books for Pecca Well. She also like is just one of the most articulate, beautifully spoken human beings that I've ever met. So again, when we go to orality and like writing, the difference between like if someone just spoke to her and then you wouldn't know that she couldn't write. And now she can, she can write, but it's still different. And she still struggles with it, but she's really fantastic at math. Even like she's in her 70s now, she loves doing math. This is Corinne John, and so this is Fed group, more Fed group. I said this as well in my article, but the geographic dispersion, so groups from all over these different countries, also made the Fed unique because there were different themes, there were different languages, dialects, mediums. So there was writing festivals, there were workshops, there were performances, there were poetry, there was prose, so many different types of writing and performances. And then what you get with that too is all of a sudden, you can see here we have Breaking the Silence. It's written in multiple languages. We have Black Ink, which is about Black writers. We have Northern Gay Writers, A Woman's Work, Let's Be Gay, My Home in Jamaica, St. Paul's People's Talking. This one is Across 7 Seas, 13 Rivers, and you see multiple languages. So you get this really expansive sense of working class identity. One of the most powerful things that I heard over and over at the Working Class Studies Association was that we often make distinctions of like the white working class and the Black working class, but there's a global working class, right? The working class in India is different than the working class in America, is different than the working class in England, but there's still a global working class, and it's not just one race, right? If we think globally about class identity, it includes people from all races, ethnicities, backgrounds. And so I think the Fed is really unique in that sense because it shows, even in this little sample, you get a really diverse perspective of working class identity here. And these are just some examples of like these are kind of stories of migration. The In Exile book. And then these are kind of like pieces of specifically about London, like different neighborhoods in East London. So there's people talking about place-based literacies. There's stories about work. So this is A Tale of the Rails, what it's like to be a railroad worker. Working lives. This is an anthology of different types of work. And then there's a lot on gendered identity. This is another quote by Sally Flood. We're taking back, we are taking history back where it belongs by writing it. Oh, and I forgot to say it. I had the quote up there. But the other famous quote by Margaret Thatcher is that, and this goes to the middle class values thing, is she said, "There's no such thing as society. There's only individuals." And the whole point of that, it's the bootstraps myth. Like, you can't count on society to do anything for you. You have to do it for yourself. And if you can't build yourself up, that's your own fault, right? And so it's like this idea of if you don't become middle class, well, it's not the government's fault. It's not society's fault. It's your fault. Yeah. And so this personal responsibility falls on the working class to make their lives better. That's really what neoliberalism is about. But that's what Margaret Thatcher, that was her rhetoric. It's like, society doesn't exist, but individuals do, so build yourself up, right? And that very famously, like, got people very, very upset as she was closing the coal mines in England and, getting rid of unions and all that. Historically, I really like this piece by Susan Cates. She says, "We still know very little about the ways in which individuals who were pushed to the margins of our educational system in various historical moments learn to read and write within the context of larger political and social goals." And so I refer to that a lot in my writing. And so this actually is an old photo. It doesn't look like this anymore, but this is the Fed archive. And how I said that projects emerge it started as a printed archive, but now it's become digital. And so, for instance, on the left, this is what you might look at in print, but on digital archive, you all saw that you can now research it in different ways, right? Like by region and by publisher. But all that infrastructure had to be built. And so that's kind of what I talk about, is like what it means to actually, first of all, have that much data and input that much data, and then figure out how to categorize that much data. And then we have PDFing. Alex has worked on PDFing a lot of these texts with me. Scanning them, so then they can be used, right? So the idea is that these don't just go live in an archive that no one goes to, but that they actually are used somehow. They're used in classes, they're used by community members, and that's why I like digitizing them, because community members can share them. In the maybe like 4 years that this website has been up, I've had, every year I get probably 3 or 4 people email me, and it's really, really heartwarming. And it makes me realize like I'm doing the right thing. Because there's like issues with copyright. Can you digitize? I got approval from the Fed executive to say digitize them all. But technically, because the Fed was so democratic, they all individually have their own copyright, which would mean I would need thousands and thousands of copyrights, which I'm not going to get. So I have something on there that says, like, if you want to take it off, I'll do it, but it's all for educational purposes. But I do have the Fed executive approval from, and the ethos of the organization was that these will be distributed, right? So I'm pretty much covered with that. But I've had multiple family members who have emailed me to say, I saw your website. My great-grandmother published a book there. Can I see it? Do you have it digitized? I didn't realize she was a writer. I've had people say, you know, my aunt has passed away. I see that you have her book written, you know, about this, and it says that she worked in a factory. I didn't know this history. I want to know it. And so they go to the archive in London, or they ask me for a digital copy. I think that, like, right there, that proves to me, like, I'm doing the right thing, right? Or I'm doing the thing that, if it's between, ooh, maybe there's copyright issues, or, okay, well, if someone wants me to remove it, I can. I think the people contacting me, like, they want these texts, right? And no one's making money off of them. So that's another thing, is they're not being sold or marketed in any way. I've also brought this into my research in ways that I never could have imagined. Like, I was able to bring multiple classes. I'm actually bringing the Regent Scholars this year to London. And we published with Sally Flood. So for instance, like, we had Sally Flood write a quote, and then my students, you know, wrote their perspective. And I think that's cool, like, actually writing with community members. And then I've been able to do different things. I don't have it linked, but write blogs about this for the TransUnion Congress Library. And so all these things were pieces of the project that I never imagined. I never could have planned for them, but they've kind of evolved over time. And then you get this opportunity. The newest thing that I have to actually, this week, I'm kind of nervous. I was asked by Labor History Today, it's a podcast, to record myself speaking about some of the Fed texts. It's like little snippets of what they are, and gonna be on a podcast apparently. Kind of nervous, but, and then the other most recent thing is, so you have this archive, you have a lot of text, but you have a whole world of people who don't know anything about it. So where do you start? And so what I decided to do was create reading guides on topics. So this topic is migration, and it has at least probably about 10 to 15 texts that I could email someone anywhere in the world and say, hey, are you interested in migration? Let me tell you what to start with in our archive. Here's a description, and here's examples, right? And so people kind of have a starting point. And so that's the newest iteration of what I've had students help me on. and I've worked on creating is a series of reading guides. So we have probably about 15 different topics. And I think a lot of you are talking about this too, but I like Lynn Tett, Mary Hamilton, and Jim Crowther's their take on this, and they say the agenda for developing powerful literacies has to be informed by issues of social justice, equality, and democracy in everyday life. Powerful literacies involve opening up many voices that are silenced by dominant definitions of literacy. It involves people deciding for themselves what is really useful literacy and using it to act individually and collectively on their circumstances to take greater control over them. Literacy is a resource for people acting back against the forces that limit their lives. And I think like these kind of definitions speak back to what Joyce was saying about the savior complex, right? There's no savior complex in this. They're saying, no, community groups who might not be literate, who might not know how to write, who might not be literate in the standard sense, right? Everyone's literate, but in different ways. They speak back in the ways that they can. And they don't need saving. They can do this in different ways. Now, what privileges we have in the university, can we use that to facilitate this in some way? Sure. But that's not like the end all be all for like helping groups, right? So I really like how they describe this language. And then these are just some examples. So hopefully some of you looked at, Sweet and Sour. We have Ernestina's, Walters. I like what she says here. She says her English was very poor. Every Tuesday afternoon, I started writing my true stories of my life, my roots for my grandchildren, because I think that when a person like me comes from abroad, it is nice to let my children and grandchildren know my past and about my younger days. And I think that that's super important. I hate how many people in the Fed say that their writing was very poor or they were illiterate or that. I mean, that just kind of breaks my heart because it reminds me of my grandma. And they don't see literacy as multifaceted because so many people have pushed them out of seeing that, right? But I think it's amazing to see someone, like to actually see this text and see the stories she's telling and how much history is lived through this language, right? And then we have Isaac Gordon's. So he said, this is work we do over 1 year and 6 months. We start off and it growing more and more, then it getting interesting. So we decide to put it together. I'm telling Judd about my life and she just write it down. I like to do it and I hope other people like to read it, Isaac and Judd. And so again, it's like this moment where you can tell he's not using standard English, but you get what he's saying and he's telling his story. And this is a moment of like really agency of like, I did this thing, like we told this story together. And so I think those are really poignant. And then the texts that like In Exile and this group, it's called Ethnic Communities Oral History Project. And so they all started as oral histories. And then they were transcribed and then some of them were interviewed and they're all multilingual, which I think is fantastic because in composition, we're all here like, how do we do multilingual stuff? These people have been doing it for decades and they don't have composition degrees. So I think that that's really poignant, And then this is my last one, I think. We have Florence, the survivor, and Florence, like I said, she is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. She says, I've missed out something. When the accident happened, and she's talking about the accident, her brother and sister died in Ghana, following her to school, actually. We had to immigrate from our village to a different city, and the people had their own language and their own way of doing things. And we carried on moving from place to place until we found the place that we wanted to live. So at last we found a village by school, but by that time I was lots older, too old in fact. I asked my parents if I could join, and they said to me, no, you're too old. And then she says in her other book, I've always wanted to write a book, but I couldn't read and write, so I joined the group at Chapeltown Community Center. I'd like to thank all those who helped me write my book. Without them, my story would have never been told. And so there's absolutely like this moment of sponsorship, right? They're thanking Judd or they're thanking Chapeltown or Pecketwell but it's not the sense of like they're still telling their story. And I love that these writers are kind of claiming agency over the story that they're telling. And so I think that's what to me stands out about the Fed text, and that's why I write about them. I was gonna do an activity with you, but I'm not gonna spend more time on this. But we might do it on. Maybe I'll do it next class actually, because I think it's a cool activity. Yeah, I might do it. We'll start class with it next time, since everyone will have their computers. But if you want to look ahead, what I'm going to ask you to do is, I think what's cool about archival work is it might be scary for some people because you never know what you're going to find. Alex, you know this, right? Like you just never know what you're going to find in archives. And that's part of the beauty of it, but part of the scariness of it, because if you're looking like, I got to write a paper, I got 2 hours in this archive, like you might not find anything. You might find a lot of cool ideas, but not have an argument. And so it's cool to like get a sense of what that method looks like how do you actually start working in an archive? And I think this is relevant for more than just archives. I think that in a lot of ways, what I learned from archival research is it allows me to like make connections and think about networks between ideas that I use, and I think it helps me in my administrative work, like because I can tell someone, oh, hey, I see this, what you're doing over here, and let me think about this. And to me, it's been a good method because it's allowed me to see things differently than I would like if I just looked like linearly. This is more like a network approach, like thinking about how these things come together. So I'll have a start class with this for 20 minutes. But before we go, I will let you out a couple of minutes early. What are some of your reactions? So I don't know how many texts you all read, and you talked a little bit about them, but what are some of your reactions of actually reading the Fed text? So I asked you to like look at Sally Flood's or the Iranian Recollections, Sweet and Sour, Isaac Gordon's, and Florence Agba's, I think. What words come to mind, or what emotions or ideas?
The Cherokee Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And because they did juxtapose it with a native language and English.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really awesome because I just got a cookbook, an Indian cookbook. I know it's Bangladesh and not Indian, but it's the introduction talks about how the women being cooks, they wanted to share that culture. They wanted to share their culture, and despite having lost a family member, their sister, she wanted to pitch in. Like it was just, it was really personal, and it's all the texts I really connected with because it just reminded me that their histories are being told, despite whether or not they had the ability to do it without someone's help.
Yeah. Yeah. Could you ever see yourself teaching them?
Those individuals?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my dad's been asking me to help him learn how to read, and it's a struggle for me right now because he's asking me to learn. He's asking me to help him to learn how to read English instead of Spanish. But I will. It's just he knows more Spanish than he does English, so I'll do what he asks. It's just it'd be a difficult task.
Yeah.
So see how it goes.
Yeah.
So I'll get my own interaction with that same.
Other ideas, reactions to the Fed texts?
I like the one by Messina, and then I can't remember the name of the man that came from Jamaica, but both of them talked about their struggles with education. Like when Messina was like forced out of school, even though she really wanted to stay. And then in the other one, how he really didn't like school, but then later he came back and as an adult, he decided to take up education again. But I really enjoyed both of those stories from that perspective.
Yeah. I think in both of those stories, we kind of get, I mean, one of the things I love about, as you know, I love this group, but one of the things I love about it is I've learned so much about history and kind of economics from it. And so like thinking about moments of forced migration, like we might know stories about the Holocaust, but getting Ernestina's story is different, and getting Isaac's story about maybe not forced in the sense of like someone pushed him to leave, but economics pushed him to leave home to find work elsewhere, and where he went was dependent upon where those jobs were available, right? In that way, it is a forced migration. And it's those precarious circumstances that are coming up. And I think there's so much, going back to the Bengali, the Bangladesh, by the Bengali Women's Support Group, I learned about histories because I was like, why are there all these, it just seemed too, like, interesting to me that there were so many Bengali women writers in the Fed, and I'm like, how did this happen? And I realized that in the early 1970s, there was it was called the Bangladesh War of Independence, that a lot of Bengali women and men left for England because of this war on independence. And so again, a moment of forced migration that I had never learned about that history, like never knew about it, but that was a direct connection between the time period that they left home and got to England and then started these writing groups. And I thought, like, another moment, like this history that was kind of renewed for me that I never knew about.
I'm looking through the poetry, the Sally Flood poetry, and some of the descriptions, this gentleman of the road is crawling with vermin and disease. That's almost identical imagery to a story out of 1860 in America, Life in the Iron Mills. The first description I ever read of, I know Stephen Crane gets a lot of credit for describing like urban life, but this predates it by a good chunk of change. The comparison there was skulking around like beaten hounds, the vile, slimy. It's the same imagery, and there's another one I'm trying to remember, London by Night, very similar to Eliot. Like for this guy who was like, well, can we, I mean, I could write 3 or 4 papers.
Yeah.
Just one-to-one comparisons, similar imagery. So there's no way to say that this was, you know, in any way influenced by it. It's just the life circumstances arrived at the author of this arrived at the same place. And
it's still poignant.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter that she doesn't have a degree in poetry or
no, you don't. I clearly renders that irrelevant.
I have to say, when I go to like, what are they called, like poetry festivals and stuff, and not all of them write poetry, some of them write prose, obviously, but Dave Chambers, the guy from Scotland, he comes up with these fantastic and beautifully written poems that he still shocks me. Even though I know he can write these, I'm still amazed because I sit there and look at him and I'm like, how do I consider myself a writer when he's producing this? Like, how? And there's moments like that I think it's really interesting, like how we distinguish like who can write and who can't, you know, or not who can write and who can't, because there's a lot of writers who don't have formal degrees, but who gets claimed as being literate and who is not, right? Literate in the sense of intelligence, and intellectualism, and that is very much based in class distinction. All right, well, I didn't actually say how, but obviously I hope you know how this connects to our class of globalization and composition. But for homework this week, just remember, bring in a draft, actually submit it to D2L, but if you're physically here, and you can print it, go ahead and bring a draft too, because that'd be just kind of cool, and I can work on it at the same time. Online students, so if you're not Skyping in right now, but you're listening to this, you have a discussion post on the FWWCP texts, and For next week, we're going to do the activity in class. So online students have to complete the activity, which is this kind of brainstorming for, just spend 20 minutes on whatever parts of this you can get to. You don't have to get to all of them. And I will see you next week. So no reading for next week. Just work on your symposium project and your exploration paper. Okay.
Cool. Go team.
Bye. Go team.
Go team.